Welcome in, everyone, to another deep dive. This time we're looking into the Meredith Kercher case. I think most people are at least somewhat familiar with this case, but we're really going to go beyond the headlines, using court transcripts, news reports, witness statements to really see what we can learn.
Yeah, this is one of those cases that just captivated the world. I mean, it had everything, international intrigue, mystery, a media frenzy that was really something else.
It really does make you think about how these media narratives can kind of take on a life of their own sometimes,
Oh, absolutely. They can definitely overshadow the search for truth and justice.
for sure. And I think before we get into all the legal twists and turns, it's important to take a step back and remember Meredith Kercher, the young woman at the heart of all this. What can you tell us about her? Like, who was she beyond just the victim label?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's so easy to lose sight of the human element in cases like this. From what I've gathered, Meredith was a really bright, vibrant person. Italy wasn't just some study abroad trip for her, it was like a lifelong dream. There's this story about her on a school trip to Italy when she was younger, and on the last day, all the other students were sad to be leaving, but Meredith was apparently really excited, and she told her teacher, "I'm not sad because someday I'm going to live here."
Wow. That's really powerful knowing that she actually did end up living there, but that her dream was cut short. It's just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
So what was she like in Perugia? Did she fit in, make friends easily?
It sounds like she really thrived there. Everyone describes her as bubbly and outgoing with a quick wit and just a genuine warmth. She just had this way of lighting up a room and connecting with people really easily, loved exploring the city with her friends, trying new foods, going to concerts, really immersing herself in Italian life.
It's such a stark contrast. You have this picture of this young woman full of life, embracing this new culture, and then suddenly it's all taken away in such a brutal way. Can you walk us through what happened that day back in November 2007?
Sure. It all started with something that seemed pretty small at the time. A cell phone was found in a garden. And as the day went on, this sense of unease started to grow. The phone belonged to Meredith, and her housemate, Amanda Knox, started noticing things at their cottage that just didn't seem right. Like the front door was open and there was blood in the bathroom.
So signs of a break-in, but something felt off.
Right. And the break in Philomena's room, another housemaid appeared staged. The way the window was broken and the clothing scattered around it just felt too deliberate, almost like someone was trying to mislead the police.
I see. And then, of course, the police discover Meredith's body.
Yeah, in her locked bedroom. It was a horrific scene.
I can imagine. This is obviously a very difficult topic to talk about.
Yeah.
The details are hard to hear, even all these years later. Can you tell us what the crime scene was like? What were the initial findings?
Well, the forensic evidence showed that Meredith had been stabbed multiple times in the neck. And there was also evidence of sexual assault.
With a crime this violent, the police must have immediately started looking for suspects. Who were they focusing on initially?
Right away, they started looking at people in Meredith's social circle. There was this Moroccan man named Hisham who had apparently been acting inappropriately towards Meredith in the weeks leading up to the murder. And then there was Giacomo. He was a tenant who lived downstairs, and Meredith had been casually dating him.
And then, of course, there's Amanda Knox, Meredith's American housemaid, whose behavior after the murder raised some red flags.
Exactly.
Let's talk about Amanda for a minute. The sources I've seen paint a pretty complicated picture of her relationship with Meredith. They were housemates, but it doesn't sound like they were particularly close.
No, it doesn't. There are reports that they had pretty different personalities and clashed sometimes. Meredith was outgoing, but also private, and Amanda was much more extroverted. Even theatrical is how some people described her. Apparently, they disagreed about things like cleanliness and just their lifestyles in general. And then just a few weeks before the murder, Amanda started dating this Italian student named Raffaele Solicito.
Okay, so a new relationship, potential tension with a housemate. It's easy to see why the police might have started focusing on Amanda. What was it about her behavior specifically that made them suspicious?
Well, a few things, I guess. At the police station, she and Raphael were seen laughing and cuddling, which, I don't know. It struck some people as odd given the circumstances. And their alibis for the night of the murder didn't really add up. They kept changing their stories.
And then there was the double DNA knife they found at Raphael's apartment.
Right. That really complicated things. The knife was found in his kitchen drawer, and it had Amanda's DNA on the handle, which wasn't that surprising because she spent a lot of time at his apartment. But then they found a tiny trace of Meredith's DNA on the blade. And that was a big deal because Meredith had never been to Raffaele's apartment.
So you have this piece of evidence that seems to link both Amanda and Raphael to a potential murder weapon. But then the case takes another turn with Rudy Guade entering the picture. Who was he? How did he get involved?
So Rudy Gued was basically a drifter known for petty theft, and his connection to the crime scene was pretty clear. They found his bloody handprint on a pillow under Meredith's body.
And he wasn't exactly sticking around to help with the investigation, was he?
No, he took off to Germany pretty quickly after the murder, but he was eventually caught and extradited back to Italy. He claimed that he was at the cottage with Meredith consensually, and then this mysterious intruder came in and attacked her while he was in the bathroom.
That's quite a story, but I'm guessing the police weren't buying it.
Not at all. His DNA was found all over the crime scene, inside Meredith's body, even on the toilet. And his story kept changing. It just wasn't consistent, and there was no evidence to support his claims about an intruder. So it was clear that he was involved in Meredith's murder, but the question was he acting alone?
So now you have three potential suspects, Amanda, Raphael, and Rudy. This is where things start to get really complicated. Did they all stay in trial together?
Rudy actually ended up facing a fast-track trial because the evidence against him was so strong. He basically took a plea deal, which meant a shorter sentence. He was found guilty and sentenced to 30 years in prison, which was later reduced to 16 on appeal. Amanda and Raphael, on the other hand, maintained their innocence and decided to go to trial, which was a decision that would put them right in the middle of this media storm that would end up captivating the entire world.
Yeah, and that's actually a good place to stop for today. When we come back, we'll dive into the trial itself, the media frenzy that surrounded it, and the shocking verdict that really sent shockwaves across two continents. All right, so we're back, and we left off with Rudy Gued being convicted and Amanda and Raphael deciding to go to trial.
Yeah.
This case was just everywhere in the media. I mean, you couldn't escape it.
Oh, it was inescapable. You
Yeah.
know, newspapers, TV, the internet. It was a 2047 news cycle, and the narrative around Amanda especially, it just spun out of control.
Right. It seemed like they were really trying to paint her as this manipulative villain.
Exactly. The Italian media especially, they just loved portraying her as this like temptress. They called her Foxy Noxy and fixated on these pictures of her out partying and her social media posts and even like her clothing choices, you know.
It's kind of crazy how the focus shifted so quickly from, finding justice for Meredith to this like obsession with Amanda.
Yeah, it's really disturbing, and you have to wonder if all that media attention had any impact on the trial itself. Yeah.
Right. Did it influence the jury in any way?
It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely influenced public opinion. And the prosecution's theory that Meredith's murder was the result of some drug-fueled sex game gone wrong, I mean, that played right into this whole sensationalized narrative that the media was pushing.
It makes you think about how easily we can be swayed by these narratives.
Yep.
So the trial begins. What were some of the key pieces of evidence that the prosecution presented, and how did the defense respond?
Well, the double DNA knife that was found at Raphael's apartment, that was obviously a big part of their case. They argued that the trace of Meredith's DNA on the blade, along with Amanda's DNA on the handle, that put them both at the scene with the murder weapon. They also had testimony from a few witnesses, including this homeless man who claimed he had seen Amanda, Raphaela, and Rudy together near the cottage on the night of the murder.
But the defense argued that the whole investigation was flawed, right?
Yeah, from the beginning. They really challenged the DNA evidence and pointed out all these inconsistencies with the witnesses.
Okay, so what were some of the problems with the investigation?
Well, for one thing, they said the crime scene was just completely mishandled. People weren't wearing the proper protective gear, and they weren't changing their gloves regularly. So there was a huge risk of contamination. They argued that the tiny amount of Meredith's DNA on the knife could have easily been transferred there during the investigation.
So they're basically saying the DNA evidence can't be trusted.
Exactly. And they also went after the witness testimony. The homeless man who claimed to have seen the three suspects together, his story was full of holes and his timeline didn't really match up with the other evidence. And then there was another witness who said she heard screams the night of the murder, but she admitted that she hadn't actually looked at a clock, so she was just guessing about the time.
It sounds like the defense was doing a pretty good job of poking holes in the prosecution's case.
Yeah, they were, but in the end, it wasn't enough.
What do you mean? What happened?
The jury found both Amanda and Raphaela guilty.
Wow. What were the sentences?
Raphaela got 25 years and Amanda got 26, plus an extra year for slander because she had initially implicated her boss, Patrick Lumumba.
So guilty verdicts for both of them?
Yeah.
I can only imagine the reaction to that.
Oh, it was huge. You know, in Perugia, there was a sense of relief that justice had been served. But in the U.S., people were outraged. A lot of people felt like Amanda hadn't gotten a fair trial and that she was being scapegoated. You know, a young American woman in a foreign country.
It's easy to see how public opinion was so divided, especially with the way the media was portraying her. But even with the guilty verdicts, this whole saga was far from over, right?
Oh, God, not even close.
Right.
The Italian legal system is a lot different than the US system, and they have this two-tiered appeals process. So it's kind of like getting two more trials.
Okay, so even though they were convicted, there was still hope for them.
Absolutely.
So tell me what happened during their first appeal. Did they try to challenge the DNA evidence again?
Yes, they did. They really zeroed in on the forensic evidence, especially the double DNA knife and a bra clasp that was found at the scene. They argued that both of those items were handled so poorly that any DNA that was found on them could have easily gotten there through contamination and wasn't necessarily proof that Amanda and Raphael were involved in the murder.
And this time around, they actually got an independent review of the evidence, right?
Right, which they hadn't been granted during the initial trial.
And what did the independent experts have to say?
They were pretty critical of the way the crime scene was handled. They called it chaotic and said there were just so many instances where protocol wasn't followed and the risk of contamination was incredibly high. They also said that the bra clasp was especially unreliable as evidence because it had been left on the floor for 46 days before it was collected.
So basically, the DNA evidence that was a huge part of the prosecution's case was now being seriously questioned.
Right. And the defense also went back and challenged the witness testimony, again, bringing up inconsistencies and casting doubt on the reliability of the witnesses.
So what happened? Was the appeal successful?
It was. And it was actually a pretty stunning decision. The appeals judge overturned both of their convictions.
Wow. What was his reasoning?
He basically said that the DNA evidence wasn't reliable, the witness testimony was weak, and there just wasn't enough evidence to prove that Amanda and Raphael were at the crime scene.
So after years of legal battles and being in prison, they were finally free.
Yeah, Amanda's slander conviction was upheld, so she had to serve a little bit more time, but she was released soon after. And Raphael was completely free to go. It was a huge victory for them and their families. But for the Kercher family, it was just devastating. They thought justice had been served, and then it was all taken away.
It's a really complicated situation with no easy answers. But even with the acquittals, this wasn't the end of the story, was it?
No, the prosecution appealed the acquittals, and they took it all the way to the Supreme Court of Cassation, which is the highest court in Italy.
So even though Amanda and Raphael were physically free, they were still under suspicion.
Right. They knew this whole thing could come back to haunt them.
What was the basis of the prosecution's appeal?
So the Supreme Court didn't actually re-examine the evidence itself. They focused more on the way the appeals judge had handled the case. They said he was too quick to dismiss the DNA evidence and that he didn't really consider all the factors involved.
So it was more about legal procedure than the actual evidence.
Exactly.
So what did the Supreme Court decide?
They overturned the acquittals and ordered a new trial. But this time it would be held in absentia, which meant that Amanda and Raphael didn't actually have to be physically present in Italy.
Wait, so they're being retried for murder even though they're back in the U.S.?
Yeah, it's a bit unusual, but that's how it works in Italy. They don't have double jeopardy laws, so you can be retried for the same crime multiple times.
That seems like it would be really frustrating for the people involved, never really knowing if it's truly over.
I'm sure it was. So anyway, this retrial happens in absentia, and the new judge basically ignores all the concerns about the contaminated DNA evidence and reinstates the original guilty verdicts.
Wow. So they're found guilty again. What happened then? Were they extradited back to Italy?
Well, Italy did request Amanda's extradition, but she fought it from the U.S. And Raphael, who was still in Italy, had his passport taken away. So it was this whole other legal battle.
This case is like a roller coaster. I mean, just when you think it's over, there's another twist.
That's a good way to put it.
So what happened next? Did they end up going back to prison?
Well, the Supreme Court of Cassation actually ended up overturning the convictions for good. This time, they cited insufficient evidence and a flawed investigation.
So finally, after all these years, it was really over.
Yeah, it was a long and complicated road, but Amanda and Raphael were finally exonerated.
Did the court give any specific reasons for why they decided to overturn the convictions?
Yeah, they basically agreed with the independent experts that the DNA evidence was unreliable because of the way the crime scene was handled. And they also criticized the prosecution for not having a clear motive, you know? Their whole theory about the drug-fueled sex game, it was mostly speculation, and they didn't have any solid evidence to back it up.
So after 7 years, this legal saga finally comes to an end. Amanda and Raphael are free to move on with their lives, but obviously they're going to be dealing with the effects of this for a long time.
Absolutely.
And what about Meredith? Did she ever really get justice?
That's a tough question. Rudy Guay, the only person who was definitively convicted of her murder, He ended up serving 13 years of his 16-year sentence and was released in 2021. And while some people believe that he acted alone, there are others who still think there were other people involved and that we don't know the whole story of what happened that night.
It's a case that just raises so many questions about the justice system, the media, and the search for truth, you know?
For sure.
It's so easy to get caught up in all the legal stuff and the media frenzy, but we can't forget about Meredith Kercher, you know? The young woman at the heart of all this. I think it's important to, spend some time remembering her, not just as a victim, but as the person she was.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the media always focuses on the accused, especially in cases like this. But it's so important to remember the human cost of these tragedies. Meredith deserves to be remembered for who she was, not just for what happened to her.
Exactly. So what can you tell us about Meredith? What was she like? What were her passions, her dreams?
Well, she was a bright, curious young woman, and she really loved Italy. It wasn't just a place to study for her. She really embraced the culture, the language, the food, the people. She was fascinated by history and politics, but she also had this really playful side. She loved music, going to concerts, dancing with her friends, just a really well-rounded person.
It sounds like she was really living life to the fullest. What was it about Italy that drew her in so much?
It seems like a lot of things, the beauty of the country, the art, the architecture, the food. But it was more than that, too. She really connected with the people there, the warmth, the sense of community, the slower pace of life. I think she felt like she could really be herself in Italy.
It makes it even more tragic knowing that she found this place where she felt so happy and at home, and then it was all taken away. What have her friends and family said about her? How do they remember her?
They say she was a loyal friend, a loving daughter and sister, someone who brought joy to everyone around her. They talk about her infectious laugh, her sense of humor, her kindness and compassion. They paint this picture of someone who was just full of life with so much potential, and it's clear that her absence has left a huge hole in their lives.
It's just a powerful reminder that behind every true crime case, there are real people whose lives are forever changed by these tragedies.
How did Meredith's family cope with all the media attention and the legal battles that went on for years? I mean, it must have been incredibly difficult for them to grieve while the whole world was analyzing every detail of this case. It was a nightmare for them. I mean, they had to relive the horror of their daughter's death over and over again through the trial and the appeals and the retrials. And the media attention was just relentless. They were constantly being hounded by reporters and having their lives scrutinized. And on top of all that, they had to deal with the fact that their daughter's case was being sensationalized and turned into this kind of entertainment.
It's hard to even imagine what they went through. Did they ever talk about how they felt about the way the case was being handled and the way the media was portraying Meredith?
Oh, yeah, they were very vocal about their frustrations. They were really disappointed with the Italian legal system, especially because they never felt like they got any real closure, even after Rudy Breed was convicted. And they felt like the media was more interested in Amanda Knox than in Meredith. They had to fight really hard to keep Meredith's memory alive and to remind people that she was more than just a name in a headline.
It's just heartbreaking.
Right.
They lost their daughter, and then they had to fight to make sure that she wasn't forgotten in all the drama.
Did the final exoneration of Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicitor bring them any peace? Did they feel like justice was finally served?
I don't think so. They said they respected the court's decision, but they still believe that the full story of what happened to Meredith hasn't been told. The focus on Amanda Knox really overshadowed the search for the truth about Meredith's death.
And of course, tragically, Meredith's parents both passed away before the case was fully resolved. Her father, John, was hit by a car in 2020, and her mother, Arlene, died just a few months later.
It's just incredibly sad. They spent years fighting for justice for their daughter, and then they were taken from her way too soon. It really shows the ripple effect of these tragedies. You know how they impact so many lives.
So where do we go from here? What can we as listeners take away from all of this? Well, I think the most important thing is to remember that Meredith Kercher was a real person. She was loved and she's deeply missed. And her story is a reminder that we need to be careful about how we consume these true crime stories. It's easy to get caught up in the drama and the intrigue, but we can't forget that there are real people at the heart of these cases.
And it's also a reminder of how powerful the media can be and how important it is to be critical of the narratives that we're being presented with. The Meredith Kercher case is one that will probably be debated for years to come. But as we continue to learn about it and discuss it, I think it's crucial to approach it with sensitivity and empathy, and to honor the memory of Meredith Kercher.
I completely agree. And as always, we encourage you to keep digging into this case on your own. Read the sources, engage with different perspectives, and come to your own conclusions. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening.